Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Bible class this morning. I want to do something special with y'all and tell you a little bit about what I got to do this past week. A buddy of mine from school in Memphis, when we were in school together in Memphis, he's a youth minister now down in Florida, down in the Tampa Bay area. And he asked me if I would be interested to kind of do a question and answer session with some of the students from his youth group, as well as some students from another local area youth group. So he got together, they submitted questions. It's very similar to kind of what we did with our What Does the Bible Say About class. And so we got to do that on a Wednesday. They submitted 7 questions, and we were able to get through most of them. Well, I'll meet up again with them next week on Zoom. But one of the questions that I thought was really interesting was this. They asked the question, how can we prove that Jesus was real? Now, for like middle school students and high school students, that's a really interesting question. Like that's a really good question to ask, because I suspect that they have probably heard either classmates or maybe even a teacher who doesn't really care about religious sensitivities or anything like that. They probably heard somebody say that Jesus didn't even exist. And so they're asking this question, like, how can we demonstrate that Jesus was actually a real person? Not even getting to the questions about his resurrection or other things like that, just how can we show that Jesus did actually live and exist? I was really impressed that they thought to ask that question, and I was really glad that they asked that question, because that's a question about history and like how historians operate. I just last month defended my dissertation, and it was about how historians operate and like how historians ask questions from ancient sources and try to piece together what happened. And so I was glad to get this question. I thought y'all might find it interesting too, for me to kind of show you how I would work through this with some high school students. And so we're going to tackle this question this morning together. How can we prove that Jesus was real? So what I plan to do with the teens, because I'm going to get to this with them next week. This is one of the questions we didn't get to. What I'm going to do with these guys next week is basically break this question down into 2 parts, 2 things that I think, one thing that the question is really asking, another thing that I think the question might be asking by implication, and it's this. Did Jesus exist, and did Jesus perform miracles? Those are 2 separate questions. We have to get to the first one first. Did Jesus exist? Because if he didn't exist, then there wasn't anybody to do miracles the way he did them. So let's ask the first question first. Did Jesus exist? Now, I am planning on telling them that yes, we can be absolutely certain that Jesus existed, that he lived in Galilee in the 1st century, and there are a lot of other things that we can know for certain about Jesus. I'm going to direct them to this short video from my friend, Dr. Michael Licona. He was one of the guys that was on my dissertation committee. He's got a really thick book on the resurrection of Jesus. He's done a lot of great work. You can find him on YouTube. Check out this YouTube video from him. If you Google, or if you get on YouTube and search Michael Licona, Jesus mythicism, and this idea of mythicism, it's not one that we talk about very often, but Jesus mythicism is a shorthand way of saying, the idea that Jesus didn't live, that Jesus was actually a myth, kind of like the Greek gods are myths and things like that. In this short video, Michael Licona, Dr. Licona says that he's done some research on this and showed that out of all the qualified, trained historians in the world, think about folks who are professors at universities. They've got PhDs in history, and like they really have trained how to do history. They're trained in those methods. Out of all the qualified, trained historians in the world, one historian's best count is that 7 total professional historians seriously doubt that Jesus actually lived. 7 out of the hundreds of universities just in the U.S. alone, but the thousands of universities in the world, with tons and tons of folks who are trained in history, with PhDs, so they're teaching at colleges and universities and things like that. This guy that was counting 7 people, 7, seriously doubt. That's not a lot. I think it's fair to say then that basically every trained historian believes that Jesus existed. Then they might disbelieve that he performed miracles, but like I said a minute ago, that's a different question. And so this Michael Licona is quoting another guy who said that, and that other guy was one of those 7. Michael Licona definitely not one of those 7. But here's another interesting thing to note. There's a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I'll give all the Cats fans time to boo. Okay, y'all are done. There's a professor of religious studies at UNC Chapel Hill, the Tar Heels, named Bart Ehrman. He's very smart. He knows the New Testament backwards and forwards. He can read it in Greek just as easily as he can read it in English. But he does not believe that Jesus is God's son. And he's really kind of an agnostic. And not totally an atheist, but maybe he kind of leans that way. He's definitely not a Christian. Okay, he was at one point in time, but then kind of gradually lost his faith through a number of different things that we don't have time to get into right now. But Dr. Ehrman, Bart Ehrman, who's, like I said, he's very smart. He's not dumb. Even he believes that Jesus existed. And he is able to argue very strongly against these folks who say that Jesus didn't exist. So you have a very committed Christian like my friend Michael Licona in that YouTube video that I showed you just a second ago. Michael Licona, very committed Christian, he argues that Jesus existed. And you have a guy who's an atheist, or has an agnostic or an atheist, Dr. Bart Ehrman, also a very smart guy. He's not a Christian, but he also argues that Jesus existed. And so both of these guys have made very strong and compelling arguments that Jesus actually lived and ministered in first century Galilee. If you want to turn to the New Testament, we can see how there's some good historical evidence that Jesus existed. When we look at the Gospels, remember I've mentioned this before, the Gospels are ancient forms of biography. And so they look very different from our biographies today. You might go to Half Price Books or Barnes & Noble or someplace like that and pull out a big, thick biography on JFK or George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, somebody like that. These biographies are huge, and they really try to show, they really try to track through somebody's life from in great detail from birth to death. Ancient biographies didn't try to do that. They really tried to hit the highlights and show you what was most significant about a person's life, and if they had already died, about their death as well. What did all this mean? What did this person's life mean? So in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, it's really kind of his introduction to his gospel. He's telling us what he's done, why he's been inspired to write his gospel. And one of the interesting things that Luke mentions in there is that Luke indicates that he knows eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and ministry. So let's take a look. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. He says, "Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed." So even Luke, by the time that he's writing, Luke says that he's aware of eyewitnesses. He's aware of people who are still around, who remember seeing Jesus, teach and preach and heal people, back in Galilee. There are still folks around who do that. Here's another thing too that sometimes we skip over. But there's a brief statement in Mark chapter 6, verse 3. Jesus had brothers and sisters. And so in Mark chapter 6, people are astounded at Jesus' teaching in the synagogue, and they ask, "Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And aren't all his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. It's interesting in the context, exactly why they took offense at Jesus. But for our purposes, I think what we see in this verse is really kind of fascinating, that Jesus had brothers. It's kind of hard to be a brother of somebody if that person didn't exist. And so Mark mentions, Jesus' brothers and sisters as well, years after Paul's conversion in Acts chapter 9. And Paul's conversion may have been only a year or so after Jesus' crucifixion. But years after his conversion, Paul ends up meeting with Jesus' brothers and other people who spent years with Jesus. And so no historian doubts that Paul lived. Okay, and I think that's important to note, that here, nobody doubts that Paul lived, and Paul is saying that he met the family of this guy Jesus, and that he met other people who spent years with this guy Jesus. In Galatians chapter 1, verse 19, Paul says that he met with James, the Lord's brother, and Peter. Well, those were definitely two guys that knew Jesus, definitely two guys that knew that Jesus actually existed, that he taught, that he healed, and so on. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5, Paul also mentions the brothers of the Lord. He's talking specifically about Jesus' actual brothers there. And so for the New Testament itself, and let's keep in mind that Paul is probably writing his letters somewhere between the late 40s of the first century to the early 60s, and that's still plenty of time for there to be eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and ministry. By the time that Luke is writing his gospel, which may be in the 70s or 80s, it's still a few decades after Jesus lived, but even then he says that there are still eyewitnesses around. Now somebody might object to this, and this is one point that I'm really going to make with the teens next week. Somebody might object and say, now wait a minute now, the New Testament sources don't count because they're all biased in Jesus' favor. They're not objective sources. Well, of course they were biased for Jesus. They thought he was God in the flesh and wanted people to love and follow him. But just because they're biased sources doesn't mean that they completely fabricated his existence. If they were going to go to all the trouble of making up a person, why would they make up his horrific and shameful death on a cross? Why would they, tell all these other things? But if somebody is still unconvinced, we can look outside the New Testament and still learn a few things about this guy named Jesus. There's a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus. He's one of our best sources for Jewish history during the first century A.D., and he tells us about how the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in A.D. 70. He was an eyewitness of that. He actually saw that. Josephus is roughly kind of around Paul's age. And Josephus mentions Jesus and Jesus' brother, James. Now, Josephus is not a Christian, and it's unlikely that he is reading the Gospels to find out information about Jesus. And so he provides kind of independent testimony to Jesus' existence that corroborates what the New Testament says. But we can go even further. There's a Roman historian by the name of Tacitus. He lived around AD 56 to 120, so born right in the middle of Paul's missionary work, right in the middle of the first century, and died right around the first couple of decades of the second century. You've heard me mention the book called the Didache before. That's right around the time the Didache was being written. This Roman historian Tacitus mentions a guy named Christ who was crucified by Pontius Pilate. And he mentions that in one of his works on Roman history. Tacitus is definitely not a Christian, and it's almost certainly is not reading the Gospels to find out information about Jesus. And so, in addition to Josephus, we have this other guy named Tacitus who is providing additional independent testimony to Jesus' existence that corroborates what the New Testament says. We can also look to some later Jewish sources as well, but because those are so late, they're really not especially helpful. But even those later Jewish sources that are kind of hostile towards Jesus, they mention his existence as well. And so if we include the Gospels and the other accounts from Josephus and Tacitus that mention Jesus, we see that multiple sources independently report that there was a man from Galilee named Jesus who had disciples, who was known to be a teacher, who lived during the reigns of Herod and his sons, and was crucified under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. And at the very least, he was remembered by his friends and his enemies as someone who could perform miracles. So that brings us to our second question. Did Jesus perform miracles? Now, obviously, I believe he did perform miracles. One thing that we can point out is that, we can look to what Jesus' friends believed about him, the people who were writing the Gospels and also Paul's letters. Jesus' friends believed he performed miracles. Now, clearly, all of Jesus' earliest followers, they recognized that he healed the sick, cleansed lepers, restored sight to the blind, even raised the dead occasionally. But what's interesting is that Jesus' enemies also believed he performed miracles. Now, earlier I mentioned that somebody might be suspicious about using the biased New Testament examples to argue for Jesus' existence. But what's interesting is we have records of what Jesus' enemies thought about him. And we see some of that especially in Matthew chapter 12, verses 22 and following. The text says, "Then they brought to Jesus a demoniac, someone who was demon-possessed, who was blind and mute, and he cured him so that the one who had been mute could speak and see. Now all the crowds were amazed and said, 'Could this be the son of David?'" And when they refer to son of David, they're talking about kind of that's another way of referring to a messianic figure, somebody who the hope is going to come and rescue or restore Israel. And so that's another fascinating conversation for another time. And so they ask, could this be the son of David? But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, "It is only by Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons, that this fellow casts out demons." Jesus responds with this idea of the house being divided, and then basically challenges the Pharisees by saying, look, if I cast out demons by the power of Satan, by whom do your sons cast them out? And he says, look, if you're going to judge me by this standard, then you need to judge your own folks by the same standard as well. This name Beelzebul, it was another name for the chief evil power, or Satan. That's another name for Satan. And so, the disciples believed that Jesus was empowered by God, but some of the Pharisees believed Jesus was empowered by Satan. But here's the thing, though. The Pharisees in this passage still affirm that Jesus was performing a miracle. I don't think that the evangelists or the disciples would just make this up, that that Jesus was accused of being empowered by Satan. I don't think they would make that up, because that's not a nice thing to say about somebody. I think, though, that what really happened was that some Pharisees did actually believe this. Some Pharisees did actually think that Jesus was performing real miracles. They just thought that it was Satan was the one who was giving him power to do that. So the thing to remember with all of this, as we kind of wrap up this, the thing to remember in these two questions, did Jesus exist and did he perform miracles? Looking at it from how a historian would look at this, there are several different accounts written within living memory of eyewitnesses by different people who loved and followed Jesus, and by people who didn't really care about Jesus at all. All of these different reports, all of these different independently generated reports, corroborate that, yes, Jesus did live. And honestly, the evidence that Jesus lived is every bit as strong as evidence for any religious teacher from the world. If we were to reject the Gospels' reports about Jesus, to be fair, then we would have to reject the reports from lots of other people in history. If we make the standard of evidence so high for the New Testament, but only this high for everybody else, that's completely unfair. But if we keep the standard of evidence the same and say, we have to have this much evidence to believe Jesus existed, then it's only fair to have that same amount of evidence. If we reject this and say that Jesus didn't exist because we don't believe that kind of evidence, then really we have to reject a lot of other things about history as well. And honestly, there's just not much that we could know about history. And so I think the best answer, the answer that makes the most sense out of all of this, is that yes, Jesus existed, and yes, Jesus did perform miracles. At the very least, even if somebody doesn't want to admit that miracles happen or anything, at the very least, we can say that something consistently happened throughout Jesus' ministry that even his friends and even his enemies believed that he was performing miracles. One other thing, too, that I saw just earlier this morning before I came in, there's an article in Christianity Today about what do Jesus' skeptics say about the resurrection. As I was skimming through the article, looking through it, it said what I thought it would say, because I've seen arguments like this before, that modern historians today, those who don't believe that Jesus actually raised from the dead, here's what many of them do say, and I think this is really, really interesting. They say that something must have happened for Jesus' earliest followers and devotees to believe that he raised from the dead. They saw something. They don't, these modern skeptical historians, they don't know what it is, but they all affirm that Jesus' followers saw something, they experienced something that led them to believe that Jesus had actually physically raised from the dead. I think the best explanation for that argument is Jesus' actual resurrection. Some people will try to come up with other arguments for that, and I just don't find those the most convincing. And so the argument to the best explanation, to kind of wrap this all up, is that yes, Jesus did actually raise from the dead. He physically raised from the dead, and he saw his disciples. He saw Mary and a lot of the other women who followed with him as well. And those events, those sightings from his disciples and these other folks, that's what prompted them to write their gospel accounts. That's what prompted them to go out and evangelize and preach to other people that yes, Jesus did actually raise from the dead. I hope this class was fun for you. I really enjoy teaching on this type of stuff. It's right in my wheelhouse, especially since what I've been doing a lot over the last year or 2 years, a lot of concentrated study and research on is on history and how historians operate. And I enjoyed putting this together. I hope the teens next week will enjoy it also. Guys, thank y'all so much for tuning in, and we hope to be able to get to see each other again sometime soon. Bye-bye.